Morning folks, Dave Canterbury with the Pathfinder School, continuing in our Fire School series. What we need to do is we need to understand that we are progressing with fire, and there is a progression of fire. If we have the proper elements in our fire kit to begin with and we haven't lost them, then we can start at the top of the food chain basically and work down. If we have not gotten our components and we've lost some things or damaged some things, and we have to start at the bottom of the food chain and start primitively, then what we need to think about is the next fire. And that always should be in the top of our mind, no matter what kit we're carrying or no matter how much gear we have. Once we have a sustainable fire, we have to think about the next fire. What happens if this fire goes out? What happens if it rains? What happens if we go on a scout and come back and the fire's dead? Lots of variables there that could happen, and that fire could not be there when you need it the next time. So you have to think about that next fire. In the progression of primitive fire, and what we teach at the Pathfinder School as well, is as soon as you get one established fire, you automatically want to char something. And the reason I say that is because char is going to be the most combustible material that you can use to create an ember without going through the hassle of the bow drill fire. You don't want to have to make another bow drill fire if you don't have to. Once you have a fire established, you char something, and that will give you an ember, provided you've got the other inputs that it takes to make that ember combust. If you've got a good knife in your kit, and you've got the proper knife that has high carbon steel on the blade and has the proper hardness on the spine that you can drive sparks from that tool, then you can just go out and look for a hard rock. And there's plenty of things out there, from chert to flint to quartzite to some forms of granite, that are going to be hard enough to throw a marginal amount of sparks. Now obviously the better material you find to drive sparks off of that blade, the better off you're going to be. But in the interim, just look for a hard rock, and that's something that you should be possuming while you're out. You should always be looking to pick up rocks. You should be checking them against your knife blade to see if they're going to strike sparks, and then you should put them in your kit. A magnifying glass is always a good option for creating an ember as well. And then if you had a ferro rod, you would have it made. If you had a ferro rod in your possession, even after you start that first fire, you may have had to use Surefire to start that fire of some sort, like a mini inferno or a wet fire or something of that nature. And you don't want to have to go through that again, or you don't want to waste those emergency resources of Surefire or Sureflame. So you make charred material so that the next fire you make, you have something you can hit with that ferro rod instantaneously igniting it, and then putting it with a bird nest, as we showed in the last video, to affect your ignition. So no matter what type of fire implements you have on your person, but especially if you've had to go back to primitive fire to begin with, char is your next step. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is making char from different types of material. Stay with me. Let's talk real quick about some of the more common materials that you would find that are going to make char for you. We'll talk about the process in a minute. One of the easiest things to find that you may already have in your kit would be some type of cotton material. And you want that to be 100% cotton. So if your bandana fits that bill, or your t-shirt, or something like that, or even the blue jeans that you're wearing, that you can cut the cuff off of, will all make very good charred material. And if you have to have that, you can use that. To conserve resources, you should be looking at natural material from the landscape. One of the easiest things to find on the landscape is called punk wood. And punk wood is basically a rotted wood that you'll find laying on the ground. It's going to be very spongy feeling. It's going to be very soft and lightweight. And when you push into it, you could tear it apart with your fingers. And you can see how I can tear that apart with my fingers very easily. That is a very good charring substance, and it will hold an ember for a long time because it has a lot of mass. So a piece like this that was charred this size would hold that ember for a good long time and give you a large bite at the apple, per se, at a marginal bird nest. So the better charred material you have, the longer that ember is going to last. This ember will have much more longevity than something made from cotton. Horsehoof, or horseshoe fungus as it's sometimes called, that grows on the side of trees in eastern woodlands, not to be confused with true tinder fungus, which is chaga. This is not chaga, this is a horsehoof fungus. Will not take spark very readily without being charred. It will take a magnification fire easily enough without being charred. It will also take sparks from a ferrocerium rod without being charred. But you have to be able to increase the surface area and reduce the mass by shaving this down into a dust for those things to work. You can cut it into chunks in this lighter area. You don't want to avoid the outer hard shell, but the inner area of this fungus works very well for charring and will hold an ember for a long period of time, even longer yet than the punkwood will. So what you would do to process this down for charring is you would use your knife or your axe, and you would basically just cut chunks, thin sliced things like this, and just thin slice it and char that, and continue to cut thin slices out of it like cheese or pepperoni or whatever you're used to cutting, and char those, and they will take spark very readily once they're charred. One of the really good things to char, and I don't have one that's uncharred here, unfortunately, but I do have a couple that are charred, is a cattail head. And you don't want to break the cattail head up to char it. You just want to put the whole head in there, maybe cut it in sections, but don't bust it up into fluff. And put that whole cattail head into whatever you're going to use to char your material, if it will fit, depending on your container. You might not be able to fit this in the hole of a glass bottle if you're using that to char in, and you can use glass bottles to char in very easily, if that's the only resource you have. But a cattail will hold an ember for a very, very long time. You could put this into a very marginal tinder bundle, and it would last a long time. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a container, and the precedence of charring is that you are going to take away one of the legs of the triangle of fire. To affect fire, you have to have ignition or heat, you have to have fuel, and you have to have oxygen or airflow. What we're going to do with this is we're going to take away the airflow and force this material to carbonize by superheating the material and turning it to a carbon-based form that we can then use as char, or will be charred. So we're going to put some of this in this container. This cattail head doesn't look like it's charred all the way through, so I'm going to put those back in as well. I'm also going to take a bit of this cloth. This is a very strong piece of cotton. I'm going to cut this into a couple sections and put it down in here as well. And then we're going to char this. Now, again, any container that you can basically close the oxygen off on will work for a charring tin. This happens to be some kind of a coffee or tea tin that came from a dollar store that had an inner lid and an outer lid. So this makes a very good charring tin because I can punch a hole in this outer lid to let some of the gases escape but not let oxygen in. And then when I'm done using it as a char tin and I'm storing my charred material in here or my fire kit, I can just put this lid on it to keep it safe and keep moisture out. So this is a very good option. Altoids tins will work. Your bottle and nesting cup will work. Anything that you can close the oxygen flow off inside of that is capable of taking the heat of a fire, going back to the 5 C's of survivability and having that metal container with a nesting cup, that is your go-to for emergency char tins. But you can find things in the woods or put other things in your kit as well that will work for char tins. And what you can see now is you can see gas escaping from this hole. Generally speaking with char, once that gas stops escaping from the hole and no smoke is coming out, the char is generally done. You want to put that container not necessarily in open flame, but on a coal bed. If you've got some flames off to the side or whatever, that's okay, but you really don't want to put it in direct open flame. You want to put it on top of hot coals or on a coal bed. Once our container stops smoking, we can pull it off the fire. We want to let it cool naturally. We do not want to open the container because we will let oxygen into the hot material adding that third leg of the fire back in there, and it will catch fire. You're not going to be able to underdo char and not be able to put it back in the fire. If it's not done, you can put it back in the fire. If you let oxygen in there and you burn it up, it's ruined. So if you're making char, you've got to remember that important aspect. Once you pull it off the fire, you need to let it cool down until the container is cool to the touch. When you can touch the container comfortably, then you can open the container. If you can't touch the container comfortably with your hand, don't open the container. So we'll let that sit for a minute. We'll open it up and we'll see what we got. If our char's not done, we can always put it back in. Now, while I'm waiting on my char cloth to cool down, I've got some wet bark here because it rained last night. So what is my next thought process with this fire? Well, I need a dry bird nest, right? So I'm going to start processing another bird nest, and while I have that fire going, I'm going to make sure that I dry this bird nest out as best I can, and then I'm going to put it somewhere and keep it dry. Because I'm going to need this bird nest for my next fire, and I don't want to wait until I need this thing to go get it ready, because everything could be wet. So while I've got fire, I need to take advantage of that and get this material dried out. And the fastest way to dry it out is to go ahead and process it down wet, turn it into a bird nest, and get that bird nest close to the fire, not in the fire, to start to dry out. If I have a sunny day today like I do now, that's only going to make things better for me. Don't waste an opportunity. Take advantage of the resources available to you, and that fire is now a resource. Take advantage of it. Drying out materials for the future, drying out your bow drill set if it might have gotten damp, or even drying it out some more would not hurt anything either. And then creating charred material that you can use so you don't have to use that bow drill set again. Those things are all important. They all have to be considered, and they all have to be thought about. And some of these things are very hard to think about and remember in an emergency scenario. So you've got to prioritize things in your head properly. Okay, once our material is cooled down in our container, we can pry our lid off and inspect our contents to see if everything is charred properly. So we've got cattail that's kind of wrapped in char cloth here. There's our cattail. And this is our charred cloth. This is our pieces of fungus, and this is all pieces of our punkwood. So we have 4 different charred materials here. All 4 of them should be viable options to put into a tinder bundle. All 4 of them can be ignited by multiple methods, and that's the beauty of charred material, is that it can be ignited with multiple methods. I can't stress enough to people how important charred material is in any situation, whether it's survival, long-term or short-term, because charred material gives you the best advantage at a second fire if you don't have proper means of making a sure flame like wet fire or mini inferno, micro inferno, Vaseline cotton balls, any of that kind of stuff that you use to make instant flame with. If you don't have that, this is your next best bet. So you always have to think about this. Okay, let's look at ignition of our char. I think we're going to go ahead and use our Mora Bushcraft Black to affect ignition on this material, because I believe this is a good, low-end, high-quality knife that about anybody can afford, that I think is one of the best bushcraft knives out there for the money, even though it is not full tang. It's about a 3/4 tang. It's not a rat tail tang. So we're going to use this to affect our ignition. So for that, we need a hard rock. We'll use this piece of flint. What I like to do is I like to stick that tool in something to drive the sparks off, like this. Okay? So first, let's look at a piece of our charred cloth. What you want to do with this is you want to pin that char cloth down and get that spread out so you've got plenty of surface area there. Then you can spark your knife, and the way you drive sparks off that knife is you're driving material off of this blade, so it's glancing blows. And you kind of have to see where that material's landing or where those sparks are landing, and then adjust yourself accordingly. Got ignition all over the place on that one. Okay. So that worked fine. Now for something that's not charred cloth, like a piece of this cattail, you may have to get above the knife. You may have to hold the knife above the material because you may not be able to get enough distance here to drive good sparks onto the material. So you may have to come up a little bit and just watch where your sparks are landing. Now don't be fooled with this cattail because it goes up very quickly and you're not going to see it very well. You're almost going to have to pick it up once you see sparks landing on it, and you're going to have to blow on it. Thought I saw a spark hit it there. Oh yeah. Got a glowing red ember there. Okay, with our charred punk wood, this stuff is pretty fragile, and it's kind of the same thing where you've got to kind of gather it up into one thing. And what I like to do is just kind of use the lid of my tin or something like that and gather it all up in there. And the more small areas that you have to collect your sparks, in other words, the more smaller pieces you have with ragged edges sticking up, the easier it's going to be to catch something on fire with this material. Again, you're probably going to have to hold your knife up above the material and drive sparks down into it. And I'm probably striking more sparks than I need to. Actually, I didn't catch one that time. I thought I caught one and I didn't. Okay, now we definitely got some going. Oops. Hopefully you guys can see that. There's a lot of that stuff on fire now in there. The whole tin's about on fire now. That stuff will catch one to the other very, very quickly once you get that going. Okay, we want to do the same thing with this material that we have charred from the fungus. We want to break it up a little bit and increase the amount of surface area that we have to collect sparks. Okay. Definitely got fungus on fire. The fungus is going to hold that ember for a long time. You can't even hardly see it burning, but it is. And it will hold an ember for a good long time. I like the fungus really well if I'm going to have to work with stubborn material like a bird nest that is marginal or damp. This stuff is about the best you can get. But again, charred punkwood is very good as well. Okay, while we're talking about charred material, let's talk about a couple of more things real quick. Let's take a piece of our char cloth that we had, and we're going to use flint and steel to ignite this. So it's very similar to what we did with our knife, but if we happen to have that steel, and this one is made from an old file that I forged, the best and easiest way to do this is to find a sharp edge and lay your char cloth on top of the stone or the rock that you're using. Then take your steel and make small glancing sharp blows against the hard edge of that. And that will make your sparks jump over onto your char cloth. I hope you guys can see that.